We are live. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first TasteJet lecture of the day. I'm here with Emma Smith, who will introduce herself and her academic interests in a second. But I'm Alfie. I'm the Outreach and Admissions Officer for the English faculty, and yeah, I'm available all day to answer your questions on Slido or in the YouTube comments. So we'll have a half-hour lecture and then 15 minutes or so at the end for any questions. If you do have questions as the talk progresses, pop them in the YouTube comments below and we'll get to them at the end. Great, so Emma, take it away.
Hi, thanks Alfie, thanks for setting this up. Thanks everyone for tuning in. In lots of ways, it's really sad that we haven't got you here in Oxford and that you're not able to look around and sort of imagine yourself here. On the other hand, it's great for people for whom that was going to be a long trip, or people who are just sort of dipping their toe in the water. So welcome to everyone, sort of whatever your whatever stage you're at in thinking about coming to Oxford. So my name's Emma Smith. I teach in the English department here at Oxford and at Hertford College. And mostly I teach Shakespeare and Renaissance drama. And today I'm going to talk about Shakespeare, thinking about Shakespeare in historical context. I'm just going to share my screen. And you'll see that we are going to be talking quite generally with some particular, let me just play from start, with some more sort of general principles, general precepts for thinking about Shakespeare in historical context. I'll try and make a few more specific examples, but I'm very conscious that you're all studying different plays and that therefore the work for you might be making the links between your play and the things that I'm talking about. So I think what I want to talk about today is sort of how it is really important to think about Shakespeare in historical context, but that actually that relationship is probably a little bit more complicated than sometimes we allow. And I'm going to be sort of pushing back against or arguing a bit with the one piece of language that we often use to describe this relationship. So we often say that Shakespeare reflects the historical context, so that he reflects views about women, he reflects views about monarchy, he reflects views about, say, a more hierarchical society. And what I want to propose today is that that reflection model is a little bit inadequate for works of art, that the work of art always draws on its historical moment, but it transforms it. That's what artists, that's what writers do. And I'm going to give some ways, perhaps of sort of overarching ways of thinking about that transformed relationship. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to come to some different kinds of words that we might use instead of reflect, to think about a slightly more edgy or sort of antagonistic even relationship between Shakespeare and his historical context. And we might just begin that by thinking about now. If we think about the kinds of cultural products we have now, the kinds of Netflix dramas, the kinds of movies, the kinds of TikTok phenomena, those things which are popular culture in our own time, they obviously do tell us something about now, but they don't tend to tell us that in a very straightforward way. So if you were to be looking back at the Netflix or TV dramas of 2020 or 2021, you'd notice probably that there's quite a popular phenomenon, which is the murdered woman, the murdered young woman, the dead female body, and the detective sort of police procedural, which understands that. Now, if you were to sort of deduce from that women are always being murdered in our society, or that there are very, very huge numbers of murders, that would actually be wrong. That's not quite what that reflects. It does reflect something weird about attitudes to women, and something strange about our attitudes maybe to the police and to authorities, and our interest in detectives and finding things out. But that's not a straightforward reflection. There are different factors in play, ideological factors, generic factors. These are dramas which all have a similar kind of shape, and they draw on the popularity of previous ones. They're the kind of things I'm going to think about in relation to Shakespeare. So if we think about our own times, we would see immediately that our cultural products have a relationship to our own time, but they don't clearly reflect it. And the same is going to be true of Shakespeare. Let's move on to something a little bit more specific, and we will get a sense of that. So the first of my precepts is that Shakespeare writes entertainment and not documentary. So there are a couple of ways to think about that. Firstly, let's think about Shakespeare as a popular entertainer. Now that seems quite a long way from us now, because Shakespeare, even for those of us who love him, is a bit of an effort, tends to be sort of subsidized in the theatre, or tends to be a kind of worthy thing to go to, rather than, say, I'm just trying to think, Hamilton or Wicked, or one of those kind of fabulous West End money spinning shows. But Shakespeare writes for a theatre which is decidedly commercial, which needs to get people in, which wants to please audiences and give them what they want, at least in as much as it wants to sort of challenge them. I mean, audiences do want to be challenged, but within particular bounds, I think. And I feel as if this is worth thinking about and bearing in mind in lots of ways. One is, I don't think most of us now look in our entertainment for moral advice or for a message. That's not really what we're up for when we choose entertainment. We probably are getting advice and even getting a message, but we don't want that to be kind of pushed in our faces. Most of us, some people, people have different views on this, but most of us perhaps don't want to go to a sermon or that kind of, moralizing, and we certainly perhaps don't want to pay our own money for that. I think that's worth bearing in mind when sometimes we expect Shakespeare to be delivering a message, and we ask ourselves what that message is, and sometimes perhaps the message is enjoyment, sort of emotional release, escapism. These are the kinds of things that the theatre can provide for audiences in Shakespeare's own time. So it's important then to remember that, and not to be drawn into the theme that's quite recurrent, I think, in Shakespeare criticism. And that's a theme which actually rather regrets that Shakespeare had to write for the theatre. And if you come across this kind of criticism, it has quite negative ways of thinking about theatre goers. It suggests that they enjoy sort of bawdy jokes or silly clowning, and that they are, these bits have had to be put in to keep them happy, and that they're, sort of not perhaps as important as the more philosophical or more high-minded bits. I think that anti-theatrical view of Shakespeare is now a bit old-fashioned, and it doesn't really fit with the facts. One thing that we've heard a lot about in the last few months is, what did Shakespeare do during outbreaks of plague in his own time? We know that the Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre endured moments of periods, in fact, not just moments, long periods of theatre closure because of the outbreaks of bubonic plague. And that's seemed to echo some of what we've been going through ourselves. Now, one of the things we do know that Shakespeare did during a period of plague closure in the theatres was to write in a different form, to write narrative poems. And in 1593, Shakespeare writes 2 narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, that are printed, and they are super, super successful. People love them. These books fly off the shelves. Now, that's really striking to me, because it's at a moment in Shakespeare's career where he's not well established as a playwright. He hasn't even really begun to make his name. He's a newbie in London, and he has this great success with writing poetry. And what he could have done is to continue in that vein. But as soon as the theatres reopen, he goes back to his attempts to get a foothold in the theatrical world and into writing for the theatre. And that's pretty much what he sticks with for the next 20 years. I think Shakespeare loved the theatre, and he loved the fact that theatre is for audiences. And it's later critics who have wanted Shakespeare to be a sort of lyric poet, more like Wordsworth or something, who have sort of tried to move us away from that. So keeping that in mind, I think, is important. It is not demeaning to Shakespeare to say he writes entertainment. And I don't think we should feel that that somehow understates or undersells what's great about him. Okay, so let's move, and just the other part of that before I move on from this slide is that that entertainment is not documentary and it's not, as we're going to come to, realist. And maybe if we just look at this collage of sort of B-list romantic comedy movies here from our own time, we can see this does not reflect our own world, does it? It is beautiful young white people with perfect teeth. This is a kind of Hollywood view of the world. This is a Hollywoodized, escapist kind of form of contemporary drama. That's not exactly equivalent to what Shakespeare is doing, but it perhaps reminds us that entertainment forms have quite a strange relation to the reality of people's lives, and that often people want to experience certain kinds of entertainment because they help them escape from their lives. And I think that's quite a big theme of Shakespeare's. He doesn't write, as you will know, he doesn't write plays about his own day. He doesn't particularly follow the fashion for what are called city comedies, comedies set in London that are quite sort of topical and quite satirical. They're very popular with writers like Thomas Middleton and Ben Jonson and Thomas Dekker, all of whom are contemporary with Shakespeare. But Shakespeare doesn't really do that. He's got a much more fairy tale sense, a much more sort of far away sense of what the theatre does and where the theatre can take us. And it's about taking us away from our regular world. Okay, let's move on. Related to that, I think, is the fact that Shakespeare's plays draw as much on literature as on real life. And so this is something that I think you'll all be aware of because you're probably drawing on this a bit in your specific studies, that pretty much all of Shakespeare's plays have major printed sources, published sources. And they're sources that Shakespeare uses in a way which to us now would really count as plagiarism. That's to say, he has the book open on his desk, and we can usually see what page, you know, what he's doing, and he's copying out bits. He's sometimes reshaping them to fit the verse. He's sometimes making sort of running corrections as he goes. But we can often see very specific forms of borrowing. And more generally, we can see that Shakespeare takes plots, place names, character names, and sort of general structure from pre-existing forms, from pre-existing work. And that's pretty much the case in every play that he writes. And there are two interesting things to me that I want to just draw out from that observation. And the first relates to this question about historical context. The inspiration for Shakespeare's plays is as much, or perhaps even more, previous literature as it is his own experience, you know, in the London streets or in Stratford-upon-Avon or, you know, in whatever world he is encountering. This is a time when to be a writer, to be a creative writer, is to show how well you know the literary canon, the classical canon, how cleverly you can riff on existing themes. These are like sort of variations on a theme that you might have in music, or cover versions almost. They're where the original is already known and is evident. And what's enjoyable about the new version is how it plays on the expectations of the old one. So if you wanted to be a writer in Elizabethan London, the advice to you would, I think, have been write about what you've read, write about what you've read. Whereas if you're a writer in the 21st century, the advice would probably be write about what you know, write about your own experience, draw on the kind of authenticity which comes from your experience. I think sometimes we want Shakespeare to be a 21st century writer drawing on his own experience, when really he's a 16th century writer drawing on his reading. And one fun example of that, I think, is you'll all be aware that there is a kind of, I don't want to be rude about it, but it really is the preserve of cranks. It's a kind of bonkers theory, really, that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare. And one of the ways of arguing that he didn't is to say he did not have the experiences that he writes about in his plays. So I think you can already see how that's based on a misapprehension about where the material for plays in the 16th century might come from. As I've said, it doesn't really come from experience, it comes from reading. And an example that's often given is The Merchant of Venice. We don't think that Shakespeare ever left Britain. We don't think he ever went to Venice. There's no evidence of that. And so people who say, well, he couldn't have written the plays then, will say, well, how did he write about Venice? The first thing to say is, if you've read Merchant of Venice, he doesn't really write about Venice, does he? I mean, he doesn't really know very much about Venice. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, the source that he takes the play from is set in Venice, and that's all that's needed. That source is imported into the new play, along with the usurer, the moneylender, and the caskets, and these other elements. So by drawing on literature as much as on real life, Shakespeare's plays have a sort of meta quality. That's to say, some of their depictions are drawing on literary conventions rather than on, as it were, real people. And one way of thinking about that might be to think about the representation of women. I'm going to keep touching on that because it's one of the places where I perceive that very often students are trying to pinpoint a kind of relation to real life, a relationship between Shakespeare's depiction of women and attitudes to women or women's lives in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. If we think about Shakespeare as a literary writer, we can see that some of his depictions of women just draw on previous depictions of women. They're quite a long way from real women. And it would be really interesting, I think, to get a sense from the female members of Shakespeare's audience, who were in the minority, actually. I think Shakespeare's plays were mostly for rather a male world, a male-dominated world, to see whether they felt that they recognized themselves in any way in these characters, or whether they saw them, as I suspect they did, as literary or theatrical caricatures or types that are enjoyable on their own terms, but that don't have all that much sort of blowback into the everyday. Related to all these forms, I think, all these questions, is just something about theatre itself. I've already suggested that Shakespeare's audience may have gone to the theatre for a kind of escape. And it's really interesting that the Shakespearean theatres are on the south bank of the Thames at a point where there is only one bridge over the Thames. So most people went to the theatre by riverboat. And for some historians, that moment of sort of transit has been the moment of entering a different kind of world, being somewhere other than your everyday, and that the theatres sort of capitalize on this escapist or kind of slightly dream factory, as later cinema would see it, element. Some of the aspects of the non-realist part of the theatre are to do with the theatre buildings itself. We've got a kind of approximation here in this little cutout paper Elizabethan theatre, which is that particularly audiences are very close up to the stage, and they are operating within the same light and sort of extended space as the performers, unlike the modern theatre where the audience is suppressed by being kept in the dark, literally being kept in the dark, and by a code of conduct which suggests that audiences should be very quiet. You may have, certainly if you've been to the theatre as part of a school trip, you've almost certainly been on the wrong side of hoity-toity theatre goers trying to hush you up. But in fact, the Elizabethan theatre really capitalised on the audience presence and audience interaction. Lots of it was more like stand-up, I think, than like the modern theatre. And not just for comedians, although comic actors, I think, would have interacted and ad-libbed a lot with the audience. I think that some of the soliloquies, those monologues that seem to us to represent the inner thoughts of characters, were probably much more theatrical and interactive. So that when Hamlet says to be or not to be, that is the question, he may not have been sort of holding his head in his hands in a moment of introspection, but actually throwing the question and the problem out to the audience. What do you think I should do, guys? You've seen what's happening. You're the only people who can really understand what it's like for me, because I have to hide what I know in this dangerous Danish fictional world. We can think about other ways in which the theatre is not realist. Almost certainly the play you're studying has some imagery from theatre, the so-called theatrum mundi, the theatre of the world, the idea that life itself is a theatre, has some of that imagery. You might think of Macbeth at the end of his tragedy about life's a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. There are lots of versions of those parallels between life and theatre. We might want to think again about female characters, all performed by male actors, and how that might have added to the sense of the kind of make-believe rather than the sort of direct reproduction. I once went to a performance of traditional Japanese theatre. It's called No theatre, N-O-H theatre. And that has very traditional character types and very traditional experience for actors who continue to play the same role all through their lives. And there was a after-show discussion with I think he would have probably described himself in the same way, a fat, balding man in his 60s who traditionally played the young maiden, the young woman the young marriageable woman in these dramas. And someone said to him, I mean, it was the kind of elephant in the room, how can you play these roles? And it's always stuck in my mind what he said. He said, that's what acting is. Acting is playing something you're not. Impersonation is when you move yourself along, sort of 2 notches as a young woman playing a young woman who has a slightly different life from you. But being an older man playing a young woman, that's really acting. And to some extent, that's not really how women's roles were played in the Elizabethan theatre. But nevertheless, that the sense that acting is being something you're not adds, I think, to that sense that what we're experiencing is not primarily realist. And that too suggests what happens in the theatre is not necessarily what happens in the street. One last example, sort of building on what I've already said for this slide. If you were an Elizabethan man who liked to wear women's clothes, I think it's pretty likely that there were people who enjoyed that then as there are now, and you walk down Cheapside, the main street in Elizabethan London, you'd probably be beaten up. If you were an Elizabethan man wearing women's clothes on the stage, the audience would love you. You would flirt with them. You would flirt with men and women in the audience, like Rosalind does at the end of As You Like It. And this would be part of an extremely pleasurable, erotic kind of exchange in the theatre. The things that happen in the theatre don't happen or can't happen in the same way outside it. Let's just have this slide about genre. Every time I show this slide, I wonder whether I absolutely agree with it. But one of the things I suppose is important is about the way Shakespeare uses comedies and his tragedies. Neither comedies nor tragedies for Shakespeare take place in his own contemporary world. We've already said that. But I think because comedies are to do with relationships, with community, with expectations and rituals around marriage and around communal affirmations, they are a little bit closer to the topical world of Shakespeare than tragedies, which tend to be distanced, very distanced by sort of place and time, tends to portray characters of a social standing who are very different from those of the audience, and perhaps tend to sort of interpose more boundaries between the audience and the fiction. The Elizabethan theatre is subject to censorship, as you probably know. It may be, most recent scholars of censorship suggest it was less heavy-handed than perhaps we have thought in the past. But nevertheless, the censor, the master of the revels, had to sign off on plays before they could be performed. And the evidence we've got suggests that he was particularly attentive to humour and to poking fun or to having jokes about things, particularly jokes about the Scots, which become very, very topical and tender when a Scottish king, James VI, comes to the English throne in 1603. Comedy, that's to say, humour, is more dangerous, more topical than the themes of tragedy, and tends to be more subject to censorship. So comedies perhaps give us a different access, or we should think about comedies differently in relation to historical context than we should think about tragedies. So we've got just a few minutes to return back to that initial premise. So I began by saying that when we think about any literature, I've been talking about Shakespeare, but you could think about this in relation to any text that you're studying or that you're reading. When we think about literature's relationship to history, to historical context, we tend to default to this word about a set of words that are to do with reflection. That's to say, we see the historical context when it is evident and identical. And the presumption is that somehow the literary work, the Shakespeare play, is going to be doing the same as we think that the historical context is, or agreeing with it. So if women in Shakespeare's time are encouraged to be quiet and humble and subservient to their husbands, we somehow expect the Shakespeare play to be doing the same thing. Now, maybe even that example can help you see, as I've been saying this morning, that doesn't really work. And we need to think about some different verbs for thinking about this relationship. So I would propose that Shakespeare's plays often interrogate historical reality, they analyze it, they offer an alternative to it, they ignore it, they try to escape from it, they show how limited it is, they enjoy a sort of theatrical alternative to it. So these are ways of saying not that the work of art is sort of floats free from or is indifferent to its historical circumstance. I don't think that's actually ever true. I think art is always, and artists are always shaped by their historical context, but that the relationship is more like this jaggedy, broken mirror, or one of those fairground mirrors where you're much fatter or much taller than you would be in normal life, rather than the kind of accurate mirror reflection that we tend to think about. We do need to think about Shakespeare in historical context, but we also need to think about how Shakespeare as a creative artist is continually transforming and rendering sort of strange and different the historical context of his audience in order to create art and entertainment rather than documentary. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to stop sharing. And we can pick up via Alfie, questions that may have come from the live stream or from that you might want to put in now. And let me just press stop share, click to exit, stop share. Great.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Emma. That was a great, I really enjoyed that. While we're waiting for a few comments to come through in the questions come through in the comments, I'd just like to go back to the point you made about kind of the ad-libbing and the stand-up element of plays. I just wonder, in that we have some very early folios and scripts, do we ever see any kind of marginalia notations of what those ad-libs might have been, you know, what the routine was?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Alfie, and I think we don't. But what we do have is some speeches for comic actors, which probably give space for those actors to sort of go off on one, really, about what they're thinking about, or what the audience seems to be saying, or, you know, what the weather's like, or what's been going around London gossip that time. And I think that often those moments are at the end of scenes. If you've got a comic figure in your play, quite often they end a scene, and that means that they can sort of keep going for as long as they want, because no one's waiting to come in. So I think it's the one thing that we've lost from the theatre, is a sense of how comedy and comic routines might have worked. And we have instead inherited perhaps a more literary and less performance set of scripts for Shakespeare, which are perhaps more tailored towards reading than they are records of how things were performed. So one of the big clowns of Shakespeare's time was the actor Will Kemp. And Kemp plays a role in, we know quite a lot of his roles, but we know two in particular, because when he comes on as a servant of the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, which doesn't seem a very big part, you think, why would you put one of your comic actors there? That must just have been a sort of opportunity for him. He's not part of the plot. It doesn't really matter what he says in plot terms. He just does Kemp stuff, I think. And we can see that because in the script, in the printed script, we know the character is called Peter, but nobody cares that the speech prefix is Kemp. So it feels as if it's just an excuse for Kemp to do his Kemp stuff. The same is true in Much Ado About Nothing, and probably in quite a lot of those 1590s comedies too.
So it was, I suppose, a known quantity then. If you put this actor, or if you're in the audience, you see this famous actor come on, you're thinking, right, we're about to see this.
And you're already expecting some of his great hits, or some of his, you know, the kind of, you know, the stuff that we all enjoy about comedians, stand-up comics that we like. You know, some of it is very familiar. We know they've got a routine, or that they do things in a particular way, and part of the enjoyment of their act is familiarity and novelty. Yeah, and certainly in the early Shakespeare plays, the role for the clowning comic actor is really, as I was saying, in the role of Peter in Romeo and Juliet, is really not integrated with the plot. It's as if it's a kind of parallel space for a really different kind of performance, really different kind of entertainment.
Okay, so do we ever see any of, maybe just in the earlier plays, kind of spaces that could be filled but aren't filled in the early
so we don't have sort of ... we don't have that kind of thing, but I think we do very occasionally we get the word etc, etc, right, which does suggest, you know, you're just going to keep going, and sometimes one thing that's quite interesting to look at about Shakespeare's plays is that sometimes it's the clown figure who is covering for some bit of backstage business. And that's quite often somebody getting changed out of one costume and into another.
Mm.
Either because their character is changing costume, more likely because they're playing more than one character and they need to do the shift. And you can sometimes see that the clown is a really useful role to say, you know, just keep going, and you know they'll hiss at you from the side when they're ready, and you can wind it up and we'll move on. So those people who are good at ad-libbing are great at covering over, you know, a little bit of a bump in the sort of practical theatre world.
Wonderful. I think, yeah, it's interesting to consider how much practicality there was in plays. I don't think many students automatically, or even in glosses in their copies of the play, get to see. Could you recommend any resources that are really useful for understanding that more?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the resources I always recommend is the British Library Discovering Literature website. That's really fantastic in that it has information from early texts, lots of stuff about different Shakespeare plays, but sort of more background that covers lots and lots of different plays. So the British Library Discovering Literature is a really fantastic resource. If you want to think about sort of modern performances, which can often tell us lots about, you know, how these plays work, look at the Royal Shakespeare Company site, so that's rsc.org.uk, and they have one of the things I find really stimulating, and I use a lot in teaching here in Oxford, is just to look at their gallery of productions of a particular play. So they might show you like 2 photographs from each production that they've done since the 1960s of something like Caliban, who has in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, who was seen probably in the 60s as a kind of monster maybe, or a kind of not quite human, or maybe a kind of magical green man from the forest, and has, you know, gone through lots and lots of iterations and is now more likely to be seen as a Black enslaved person, or a kind of indigenous American, First Nation American, or something, and you can just see that in the production photographs, and it's really, really stimulating just to glance through the photos and get a sense. Oh, okay, wow, this play could look like that. Could look really. You know, here's a real forest, and here's trees, and here's leaves and everything, and then here's a kind of concrete jungle, and that's where they are in the Forest of Arden in this production. So I really recommend that.
That's it's a really nice thing to consider. Thanks. So again,
if you've got a more visual imagination than a kind of verbal one, yeah.
Certainly. We've got a really interesting comment here, kind of linked to what we were talking about comedy. Why do you think that popular entertainment is not perceived to be as worthy of literary analysis in the same way I'm assuming that Shakespeare might be worthy of literary analysis?
Yeah, it's hard to think that's other than snobbery, isn't it? That in some ways what we think of as worthy of analysis is something that is sort of too difficult for many people to enjoy, or too rarefied, or too historical, or too arcane. So I think we've got a very contradictory attitude to Shakespeare in contemporary culture. On the one hand, we want to say Shakespeare's for everybody, and in fact we want to enforce that by making everybody study it at some level at school, and we subsidize the theatres that produce Shakespeare, and all of that kind of thing. And on the other hand, we want to say, but Shakespeare's actually really difficult, and if we don't want Shakespeare to be dumbed down. That's that's a really bad phrase. I think it's a really superior or kind of class conscious phrase, because it suggests if you've made a Shakespeare that has a wider audience, you must have made it stupid in some way, because of course the wider audience is stupid, and I think that's really disturbing. So I think popular entertainment has always been the sort of second, the kind of B list compared to high art, and Shakespeare is one of the figures who has moved from being popular entertainment into being high art.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's worth mentioning that at Oxford, when you come to your dissertation, you can write on virtually anything, provided there's a tutor who can support you.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And we do loads of different kinds of stuff like that. Like lots of the Shakespeare work actually is also on Shakespeare's relation to popular culture in his own day, and more recently, you know, I've seen great work on kind of Shakespeare and advertising, Shakespeare and graphic fiction, the overlap between Joss Whedon's film of Much Ado About Nothing and Buffy, you know, those kinds of things. I mean, because Shakespeare's got such a big reach. You don't have to do it in relation to Shakespeare. Alfie's absolutely right. You can do your dissertation on anything at all. But the Shakespeare work we do tends to be as much about the reception of Shakespeare by later writers and the adaptations that have been made around the globe and by into different media, as much as they are about the Elizabethan period and the sort of doublet and hose that we might expect.
Certainly, yeah. But yes, I think it's great to kind of stress the fact that all literature is worthy of analysis, and even things that aren't obviously literature, like stand-up comedy routines, Sarah Millican routines, a transcript of that, you could certainly work on that.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting one. Do you think metatextuality and magical realism are counterintuitive?
Gosh, I might need to get a bit more information about where that question is coming from. So if you can type in any more detail about perhaps what you were thinking about. I mean, magic realism is a really interesting term to think about in relation to Shakespeare. It's obviously, it's one of those really productive anachronisms. You know, Shakespeare doesn't know that term, it's not available to him, but it is available to us. And thinking about it backwards can help both clarify what magical realism is and what's working in Shakespeare. I think the way in which it seems useful to me is in just sort of challenging our assumption that these plays should be realist, that they exist in a sort of continuous space and time, that the characters are continuous and psychologically plausible. There's lots of good ways that those kinds of readings can get meaning from Shakespeare's plays, but it's good to step back from them sometimes and think, not why does this character behave in the way they do, but why does the play need this from this character at this moment, or what would they be like without this character doing this? And to think about the structure of the fiction rather than it's a tendency we all have, isn't it, to think about ourselves, you know, and one of the great things about literary study is it can be a way of understanding ourselves better, or sort of broadcasting back to ourselves what we think is important. But we also have a sort of obligation, I think, to step outside ourselves and to think about literature which is not relatable to us and which doesn't sort of just sort of amplify our own sense of ourselves, but challenges that.
Yeah, so we've just had some clarification on that question.
Right.
Perhaps I misappropriated the term magical realism when you were talking about escapism and Shakespeare's fairy tale-esque style. It made me think of how that translates to the audience reaction to soliloquies.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a really good question. Yeah, I think that thinking about Shakespeare's plays as fairy tales which audiences recognize as sort of distinct and generic rather than real is an interesting way of thinking about soliloquies, and it's interesting in two different ways, two contradictory ways, as the question sort of suggests. One is, we could argue that the plays toggle between different modes. That's to say, they have moments of fairy tale and moments of emotional realism, even if even if that's not necessarily within a broader realist context, the emotions that are being expressed are realist. That might be a model that says, what's interesting about these plays is that they shift between modes, and we need to be alert to that and to think, you know, this character, maybe this comic character is operating in one kind of a mode, this other character is giving us something different. Or we could say that the kind of fairy tale element pervades the whole thing, and that we're not getting, you know, that it should make us think twice before we assume that what we're getting is something authentic or sort of emotionally realistic in those soliloquies. I think you could argue, as with Shakespeare, you can almost always argue it both ways.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm aware we are approaching the end of our time. There's a couple more questions that I think are really would be quite useful to get your opinion on. So you mentioned in your lecture that the culture of the time was to write about what you've read and not about kind of what you know in your own experience per se. I think a different perspective on that is when Shakespeare uses other authors in his work, is that a detriment to the artists whose work he utilised? How does it affect them?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting argument, really interesting question, because what we have tended to assume is that Shakespeare sort of ransacks these previous stories and just makes them better. If you read any kind of account of what Shakespeare has done with his sources, it's usually to say, well, he's made this more complicated and more interesting, he's made this more satisfying, he has compressed this time scheme that was all over the place and made this much more sort of a much more sort of dynamic plot. But it is interesting to think how the as it were, the host texts deal with this parasite, and whether I think that's interesting. It's interesting to me because we often think about Shakespeare as the origin that then other people use and adapt for their own purposes. And what this question allows us to see is this is a longer perspective. Shakespeare adapts his own sources and then is adapted in turn. So it's almost like, I mean, it's a bit close to the bit close to home, isn't it? But it's almost like a kind of mutating something that is in flux across time.
Sure.
I'm thinking about, I mean, often Shakespeare is using work that we wouldn't read now other than because of the connection with him, but not always. I mean, there are classical elements in lots of the plays. There are elements from Holinshed's histories. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting sort of philosophical question about those relationships.
Yeah, I really like that point. And so kind of following from that, you know, if Shakespeare's not necessarily raising the profile of other authors, because that's the tradition, you just briefly said there, what kind of avenues can other authors take by being used by Shakespeare, if that's a sensical question?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't think we get, as we might do now, a sense that the work that's been used by a best-selling author, for instance, gets a bit of a boost itself. I'm just trying to think of an example. I can't immediately think of an example, but that
I'm kind of thinking of almost like bands doing cover songs. Do you then go to the original band?
Exactly. You might, yeah, exactly. And that you can sometimes see that in the sort of Spotify charts and stuff, can't you? That something that isn't itself in the news, but that is a kind of an earlier version of that, or something has come back to the fore. Yeah, completely. I think that's a really good. But I don't think we have evidence that happens
right
in the Elizabethan period. There's perhaps more of a sense of maybe of sort of slightly of forward momentum, and that the latest thing sort of slightly trumps or supersedes the earlier ones rather than sort of brings them along. brings them along in its wake. I think what we can say is that Shakespeare, for example, when Shakespeare goes to the big compendium of history plays, Holinshed, for his history plays, he probably alerts lots of other playwrights that this is a good source, and other people also go and sort of find different historical narratives that they want to tell from that. From that.
Brilliant, thank you. One last question, I think this is a nice one. Do you think, in fact, literature is even more interesting because it portrays a distorted version of history, and we have to work a little harder to see those parallels to the society of the time?
I think that's absolutely true. It's a really good way of putting it, and I think that's it's an interesting test for ourselves now, isn't it? To think why are we getting the kinds of popular art forms that we're getting? What does that tell us about ourselves now? We don't just need to be at a great historical distance to see that. We can sort of ask that as involved consumers of art, fiction, theatre, all kinds of things in our own time. So yeah, I think absolutely. I think that the work of seeing the sort of distorted version is a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Emma. And I think just on that last point, looking at things in a different way is completely what we want to encourage you to do here at Oxford, as part of the English degree. And in contact with such world-leading academics as Emma, that's what we can help you do. We want to help you think in a new way. We're interested to see what you think, and would love for you to join us and explore it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alfie. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Emma. Have a nice day, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.